Salutations, future Twig. Past Twig here once again, and we're back with another card call-out for everybody. Today we actually have our very first ever doubleheader for card call-outs, where we're actually going to be looking at two cards instead of just one, because these two cards happen to be intricately linked to one another, as you'll see. First off, we're going to talk about the smaller of the two cards up here on screen, which is God-Pharaoh's Gift. 7-mana artifact, colorless artifact. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you may exile a creature card from your graveyard. If you do, create a token that's a copy of that card, except for it's a 4/4 black zombie, and it gains haste until end of turn. So obviously this works great in decks where you're sacrificing creatures, discarding creatures, creatures that enter the battlefield effects like Ravenous Chupacabra, stuff like this. Makes a lot of sense to have a card like this in here where you can get more recursion for free at the beginning of combat on every single one of your turns. With that being said, 7 mana is quite expensive and a little bit difficult to find this card and be reliant upon it, which is where we get into the other of our two cards we're looking at today, which is Gate to the Afterlife, which I think is a much more playable artifact in a lot more decks because of what this card does. And in decks where you do want to be using God-Pharaoh's Gift, you're almost always going to want Gate to the Afterlife as well, just because these two obviously synergize together a lot. So let's get into Gate to the Afterlife. So 3 mana nets you an artifact that says, first off, whenever a non-token creature you control dies, you gain 1 life. Notice that this is not a May trigger, you will be gaining life. Then you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. And then, of course, its activate ability is you pay 2 colorless mana, tap it, sacrifice Gate to the Afterlife, search for your graveyard, hand, and or library for a card named God-Pharaoh's Gift, and put it onto the battlefield. If you search your library this way, shuffle it. Activate this activate ability only if there are 6 or more creature cards in your graveyard. Okay, so Gate to the Afterlife has a wall of text, as you can see, but it's doing a lot of different things that we're going to be talking about today, and obviously there are a ton of different synergies because of all the different things that this card is actively doing. First off, creature sacrifices its proc, clearly. Second off, you're gaining life. Third off, you're drawing cards. And fourth off, you're actually discarding cards. And all of these are different abilities that different types of decks care about quite a bit. In addition, if you are running a sacrifice and graveyard heavy deck theme, having God-Pharaoh's Gift in your deck makes a lot of sense with this card because it can search for it from anywhere. It's not just your library. You can also get it from your graveyard and your hand, and it puts that big mana artifact directly onto the battlefield, which negates that huge 7 mana casting cost. So obviously you need a lot of creature cards in your graveyard, but of course with a lot of sacrifice and graveyard-based decks like mill decks, you're going to have a lot of creature cards in your graveyard by default. So obviously a lot of different synergies here. Let's get into some of them. First off though, this card just got reprinted in Aether Drift, so it's only 8 cents currently. But God-Pharaoh's Gift, it's a little bit more. You're looking at like 15 cents overall, but still not a huge price hike. And last but not least, it's in hardly any decks, only about 6,500 decks. And let's based on EDH rec, and then let's get into some of the synergies. Alrighty, and right off the bat, of course, you've got to be thinking cards like Shirei, Shuzo's Caretakers. This is a staple mono-black sacrifice commander with a lot of creature recursion, and in particular, it's one that does not care about bringing creatures back as tokens copies of themselves. Like Kizu of the Bleak Coven, it actually brings them back as full non-token creatures. So the whole idea of this particular commander is you sacrifice a bunch of 1 power creatures, they die, they come back, you continuously sacrifice them, and at the end of each turn, they continue to come back, obviously, all the way to the end of time. And as you can imagine, Gate to the Afterlife is a very solid card in this deck. Mono Black has a ton of different cards that cause it to lose life, often for the ability to draw cards. So having Gate to the Afterlife, where you're actually gaining life back, is a great way to give your Mono Black deck some survivability in a format where you're probably going to be taking chip damage from virtually anything. Secondly, you're drawing cards, which while Mono Black has a lot of options, having card draw just for killing creatures in a Shirei deck is very powerful, and even the discarding effect is actually quite powerful, because a bunch of different creatures like Tenacious Dead that you might use with Shirei have abilities that basically say that whenever something happens, you can basically pay a little mana to have them come from the graveyard directly back to the battlefield, even if they weren't put there from the battlefield. And obviously then you can just discard that card, proc it, usually it's like sacrificing something or attacking, and then you can just bring your creatures back as well. So it gives other ways basically to get creatures out onto the battlefield from the graveyard. And lastly, you could obviously use God-Pharaoh's Gifts with Shirei, though I would say with this one, because Shirei cares about getting a lot of creatures out without as non-token versions of themselves, it may be a little bit less powerful, but there is a case to be made for including God-Pharaoh's Gift, because in the event that you have too many creatures in your graveyard and they're not coming back all the time, being able to get out a 4/4 in the right situation is actually quite powerful. Moving on, we actually have another card, which is Taunos, Solemn Survivor. And this guy's quite interesting because he has an activated ability, which is 2, tap, create a token that's a copy of up to 1 target artifact token you control, mill 2 cards. And then, of course, you have his main ability, which is pay 1 in Esper, sacrifice 2 artifact tokens, exile an artifact or creature card from your graveyard, create a token that's a copy of the exiled card, except that's an artifact in addition to its other types. Activate only as a sorcery. So obviously there's a lot going on here, and he's a very artifact-centric commander, which, as you know, both of the cards we're talking about today are artifacts. However, I have seen people build this as an artifact creature deck, and in that case, having Gate to the Afterlife out allows you to, again, draw cards and discard cards, which can actually be very impactful because Taunos in particular cares about exiling artifacts and creatures from the graveyard. So being able to discard something you care about, exiling it with his ability, very powerful. Secondly, life gain is always helpful in a commander game regardless of what's going on. And lastly, God-Pharaoh's Gift actually makes a bit of a sense in this deck because it's a big artifact, which he can kind of get around by being able to recur it for free by exiling it from the graveyard. And in addition, it's helping to do what Taunos is already doing, which is that you have a bunch of stuff in your graveyard, and he's helping to basically get those creatures, get those artifacts back out. And if you have artifact creatures that you're bringing back, Taunos can even duplicate the artifact creature tokens brought back using God-Pharaoh's Gift. So there's a lot of different ways that I think these two cards can actually synergize with Taunos to give him a lot more power and do what he wants to do. Last but not least, and we're looking at the life gain effect of Gate to the Afterlife in this case, is Ali, Eternal Pilgrim. This commander is doing everything that Gate to the Afterlife cares about, and it's also doing stuff that God-Pharaoh's Gift actually cares about. So obviously Ali, Eternal Pilgrim is a 2/3 core cleric for 2, with Death Touch, and she has 1, sacrifice another creature, you gain life equals to the sacrifice creature's toughness, and pay out 1 in Orzhov, sacrifice another creature, exile a target non-land permanent, activate only if you have at least 10 life more than your starting life total. So this commander cares about having a ton of life and keeping it high, your life total high. Obviously, Gate to the Afterlife helps out this a ton. She's going to be sacrificing a ton of creatures. Again, sacrificing non-token creatures allows you to draw and discard cards. And last but not least is, of course, God-Pharaoh's Gift. And God-Pharaoh's Gift is very interesting because what it can do is it can bring back creatures from the graveyard, which Aliyah does not have directly built into her. And in doing so, it brings them back as 4/4 zombies, which is very powerful because, as you can see, being able to sacrifice that means you can that creature means you can gain 4 life potentially, as well as all of the other effects that you would want with an Allele deck. So I think both of these cards could also be used in Allele to help keep her life total high and help give you a bunch of effects. And that is actually all we have for you guys today. Thank you very much for tuning into this card call, and have a wonderful day all. Take care.